Hello and welcome to Catholicism Meets Confucius. I am very lucky to be joined by James Cino, also known as Cino Literature. Hello, how are you doing?
Good evening. I'm very well, AM. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, this is your first appearance on the channel. We've spoken on other channels elsewhere, notably Nathan Hood's Pendragon Foundation. But would you like to introduce yourself to the audience and perhaps give us a little bit of what you do?
Well, I've been running the channel called Sino-Lit for a few years now and covering everything to do with Chinese history from the Warring States era and the Zhou, Shang, all the way up to the Ming dynasty more recently, and all the historical figures in the in-between period. And more recently, as well, as you mentioned, focusing on outside of this, my love of castles and working with the Pendragon Foundation on that to restore our castles once more. And they might seem like very different subject areas, but I see them as complementary because once one knows how civilizations rise and fall, it made it very clear to me the very, very dear need to restore things where we are. So studying China made our situation very clear to me indeed, and that's why I work with them.
Yes, again, full disclosure's sake, my area of knowledge, putting sort of very loosely, is on the century of humiliation and on Japanese history in general. So I'm going to be deferring far more to your expertise, given especially around the Ming Dynasty. You know far more than I have, and have a wealth of content out there which people can peruse at their own leisure. But talking about seemingly incongruous topics, for people who are paying attention to the trajectory of this channel, the last thing I talked about last weekend was Immanuel Kant. And I mentioned rather offhandedly how there was this Enlightenment conceit towards a Sinophilia directed towards Confucianism. And someone sort of brought up that topic and wanted me to expand upon that. And here is your explanation here, how someone like Immanuel Kant and the European Enlightenment can relate back to Confucius and the experience of Matteo Ricci and the Catholic Jesuit missionaries there. So that's where I want to start and where I want to work back towards Confucianism. There are three main thinkers who really became enamored of Oriental studies and Chinese history and Confucianism, which set the tenor for the European Enlightenment. One is Gottfried Leibniz, who I would almost regard as the secular founder of Orientalism. Then we have the naturalist philosophers such as Diderot. You can say that this is a precursor towards modern atheism, and the deists such as Voltaire, who again had a very enlightened view towards the Chinese. And I want to begin this conversation by citing an article by Walter Davis, China, the Confucian Ideal, and the European Age of Enlightenment. And as with everything on these streams, if you want to interrupt me at any time to interject, then please do so, James. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Europeans manifested an almost unbounded enthusiasm for diaries and informative tomes written by Western merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and travelers concerning the Americas, Africa, Persia, India, China, and the Indies. Whether factual or purely fictional, these accounts enthralled Westerners and fired their imaginations. The theme of the noble savage received a sympathetic response and gave rise to a rather naive humanitarian idealism that extolled primitive virtues presumed but not proven. Fanciful tales appealed to man's insatiable propensity for fantasy and his desire to escape from the known evils of his own society to the blissful delights supposedly enjoyed by primitive peoples. This is actually primarily Rousseauianism. Under such conditions, the natural goodness of man, romantically alluded to by rejecting the Christian doctrine of man's fall, could putatively blossom forth to the benefit of all. Yet for most writers, especially those of France, praise of some distant utopia remained merely an instrument of social criticism, a means of denouncing corrupt practices, inept government, religious dogmatism, economic ills, or urban luxury, and artificiality without running afoul of censors. Descriptions of China, an ancient and highly developed civilization, replete with historical lore, quaint customs, a humanistic moral philosophy, were particularly appealing. Indeed, Neo-Confucianism appeared to be the ideal prototype for a deistic ethical system espoused by many European intellectuals. Deism had its inception in a desire to establish a rational religion consonant with all creeds but embracing none. It presumed the existence of a divine providence as author of a cosmic order, a supreme deity whose natural laws govern the universe. Man should conduct himself in conformity with these laws as he rationally conceived them, and lead a moral and upright life, treating everyone as he would be treated, and rendering to deity and his fellow men their proper due. In accordance with how one fulfilled these obligations, he would be recompensed after death with rewards or punishments. Like deism, Neo-Confucian metaphysics resulted from a perceived need to meet a challenge. In the case of deism, divisive or antipathetic sectarianism. In the case of Confucianism, the inroads into Chinese society of Buddhism and Taoism. In both cases, rational accommodation with philosophy was provided. For Neo-Confucians, this involved assimilation of certain Buddhist or Taoist elements into their ethical system, the creation of metaphysics, which neither Confucius nor Mencius nor any of the early teachers could have foreseen. For though they did not deny the existence of a deity, they confined their preachments to man's relations with his fellow man in the world. Borrowed from Taoism was the doctrine of self-transformation involving the Tao and its two interacting modes of yin and yang, while from Haiyan Buddhism was taken the concept of Li, the undifferentiated, self-caused, eternal, inalterable, self-evident cosmic principle, the source, the essence, the highest standard of all things. Emanating from the great ultimate was material force, Qi, in the dual modes of yin and yang. I want to again apologize to everyone in the chat beforehand that my Chinese pronunciation is going to be absolutely horrific, and I'm sure James Cino is going to be providing far more authentic pronunciations as we go forward in the stream. But this is really to emphasize that from the point of view of European onlookers, Confucianism wasn't a strict dogmatic religion in terms of their own experience with clericalism and Catholicism, and explicitly unlike Catholicism, there was this room for interpretation and syncretism, i.e. blending features of other religions into the overall Chinese system of philosophy and religion. And so therefore you can find it especially appealing to someone like Immanuel Kant with his categorical imperative, who looks to certain examples you can find, even the belief in a god, whether it be a Christian god or any conception of a deity, is conducive to moral principles, and that it is the law and the moral principles who stand as a necessity above that of believing in a god. But would you think, James, that that is essentially true, that Confucianism is more complicated than looking at it simply as a religion, as we would say, for example, would look at Christianity or Judaism or Islam in the West?
Indeed, yes. Yes. With Jushi and the aforementioned Neo-Confucians, we get a sort of smuggling in of certain assumptions that Confucius himself did not make. For example, Mencius assumes the good, that humanity is essentially good. And Jushi also smuggles in, well, he doesn't smuggle in because I suppose he makes it very clear that that's what he's doing. He's trying to, as you mentioned, bring together elements of Buddhism and Taoism and make it all make sense in light of Confucian writings. Yet at the same time, right at the beginning, Confucius himself doesn't really have a clear opinion articulated either in the Analects or in his other works about the nature of humankind or God. He doesn't really speak to that. he speaks to things like the propriety and morality and the Tao. In fact, he does use that word, the very same character in his writings, a fair bit. And he also has an articulation of the golden rule as well, in a negative sense. What you do not want done to yourself, do not do unto others. But he doesn't have a fully formed theology, we might say, would be the correct word to use. That is true. And yet over time, as is what happened with Taoism, over time certain folk beliefs get overlaid on Confucius's original ideas, and we do end up with something quite different from what Confucius himself or his immediate disciples would have agreed with. And there's of course also the, unfortunately, I would argue, mostly forgotten figure of Xunzi, who was also a disciple of Confucius, but disagreed with Mencius and said that, in fact, human nature is evil. In fact, that over time, that side of Confucianism has been really left by the wayside, particularly since Juxi and the Neo-Confucian. So I'd mostly agree with what you're saying there. Yet, at the same time as that, over time, with those folk beliefs laid down, and in the end, I suppose Confucius, despite his own objections, I would argue, he himself became a sort of idol in quote unquote Neo-Confucianism. So they do, over time, that some elements of a religion do come in, but it's certainly not in keeping with what Confucius himself would have advocated for.
So a couple of things to bring up based on what you've discussed there. With the golden mean, you're of course referring to Aristotle. Do you believe, because there is evidence of this, especially in the works of Ricci, we'll come to that a little bit later, there could be said to be a broad crossover in some respects between Aristotelianism, pragmatic philosophy and ethics, with Confucianism? And would you say that with a figure like Confucius, some people interpret him more as a philosopher and others more as a religious prophet?
Yes, that unfortunately with Juxi, that was it, from the Song dynasty onwards. I think it's the 1100s off the top of my head. We certainly get a religious element brought into Confucianism that wasn't there before. And pre that time period, we're talking about when Confucianism really it becomes part and parcel of the Han dynasty's legacy, with the exams, the imperial exams being brought in, and it becoming the very topic of those meritocratic imperial exams. Then for that 1,000+ years from that time onwards, every single scholar or literati of worth his salt is memorizing the Confucian texts, the Analects. So yes, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Aristotle there as well.
Well, regarding Aristotle, just to build on that point before I let you come in again, in the same way that we have the Confucian ethics being the bedrock for the Chinese examination system, in Catholicism, of course, we have Thomism and the reacquisition of Aristotelian texts and a whole plethora of subjects, which is kept in Islamic and Byzantine and ultimately rediscovered in Latin sources as well. So even on that level, in terms of a received wisdom and recontextualizing it into a religious setting, it would seem that Aristotle also is quite an interesting comparison to someone like a Confucius.
Yeah, one reads the Analects, for example, and on many times I stopped myself and thought, am I reading something by Aristotle here? Particularly Xunzi, I would say, particularly Xunzi. They really come to a lot of the same conclusions. One could read the Xunzi in a decent translation by Burton Watson and think there's a lot of crossover here with Aristotle and a lot of the conclusions he came to. And it's worth bearing in mind, everyone, that this is a note in general when reading Chinese translations. Don't read any of the modern tosh by people like Stephen Mitchell. They're absolute fakes. They don't even read Chinese. They don't write Chinese. They don't speak Chinese. They make up their own translations. So read a good translation by James Legge. That's a quick note. That's a particular bugbear of mine because I see things that Stephen Mitchell translated. For example, the Tao Te Ching, and it's atrocious what he did to it. He completely makes up his own creation. Anyway, yes, there are certainly a lot of crossovers with Aristotle and the early Confucians. Definitely.
Well, it's quite interesting in the sense that Mencius and Aristotle were actually direct contemporaries. We're talking around the same time. We're talking about the 3rd and the 4th century BC. But continuing on, and this is a short segment from again, I'm going to butcher it, the Tai Chi To Shuo. The great ultimate, through the movement, generates yang, active force. When its activity reaches its limit, it becomes tranquil. Through tranquility, the great ultimate generates yin, the passive force. When tranquility reaches its limit, activity becomes again. So movement and tranquility alternate and become the root of each other, giving rise to the distinction of yin and yang, and the two modes of material force are thus established. And this is Davis. The incessant and perpetual oscillation of yin and yang, as they harmoniously interact and give rise to one another, brings into existence the 5 agents of water, fire, wood, metal, and earth. All things result from constantly reproduce themselves in the continuous interplay of these forces, and all things possess Li, the principle of being or reason, so that all are in the great ultimate, and the great ultimate is in all. Thus, the universal and the particular are complementary and interdependent aspects of reality. However, as one of the Sung masters of Neo-Confucianism thought proclaimed, it is a man who receives the material forces in their highest excellence, and therefore he is most intelligent. His physical form appears, and his spirit develops consciousness. The 5 moral principles of his nature, humanity, gen, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and faithfulness, are aroused by and react to the external world and engage in activity, and good and evil are distinguished. Back to Davis. Man is equipped through reason, therefore, to understand the immutable and harmonious moral order of the universe, what Occidentals, i.e. Westerners, might term natural law. Since he possesses Li, he has a natural propensity for doing what is right and good. And that particular segment is again directed at the sort of Confucian philosophy which they've inherited through many eclectic and you could say fallacious sources, which will be completely conducive with the categorical imperative, Kantian philosophy of religion, and deism more generally, as to again why Voltaire would have such a romantic view of China and look to it essentially as a model which can replace Catholicism, which is ironic given the fact that I'm deliberately framing this conversation as Confucianism interacting with Catholicism, and yet after this process of interaction, the interpretation of the Enlightenment is that Confucianism is morally superior to Catholicism in every way, despite again them being Westerners and Confucianism being an Eastern ideology. We haven't got to the stage of the century of humiliation where the cultivation and aspects of, you can say, civilizational superiority emerged from the Western mindset in order to impose itself on the Chinese predicament. So this romantic China is seen as a model to the West, and I want to further expound on this towards the very end of the conversation. But in terms of looking at this historically, within China, there has also been a great animus directed against Christianity. And it's because of that relationship between Christianity and the century of humiliation, which begins with the Opium Wars in the 1840s and reaches its height, I would say, when Mao Zedong expels the Christian missionaries in 1951 after World War II and at the height of the Korean War. So a figure like Matteo Ricci, who was the main subject of this conversation, encapsulates a a window in time where there was accommodation between quote unquote Western Christianity, i.e. Catholicism, and Chinese Confucianism from the late 16th century, so around the 1570s up until the 1830s. In order to summarize a lot of modern Chinese historiography over the subject, there is an article in the description by D.E. MUNGELLO in the further reading if you want to find more about it. But to put this very simply, in the post-Maoist era, so in the 1970s, and also we're talking about the conciliar era in the church, so post-Vatican II, there has been a new accommodation between Catholicism and China in the modern day. And in the years following the publication of this specific article, this was written in 2012, 14 years ago, there has been a very controversial agreement brokered between the Chinese Communist Party and the current Cardinal Secretary of State, Pietro Parolin, who just earlier last year was considered the main candidate to replace Francis as Pope. So therefore, the Chinese rites controversy and the legacy of the Jesuits in China is actually a very prescient subject and has been over the last 10 years or so, given the backdrop of this agreement, because it always forms, you can say, a critique by quote unquote traditional Catholics that the modern church has been almost overly accommodating in its view towards China and overly confrontational with regards to certain elements of the conservative Catholic Church. So ironically, again, it's, you can say, the same dynamic is repeating itself as it existed really in the 18th century compared to what we have now. But we finally come to a brief history, I would say, of Chinese Christianity. And I want to put this question to you, James, which is, how early are we talking about in terms of the first interactions between all manner of Christians and China, not just talking about Catholics and the Jesuit interactions beginning with the 16th century? Where does this interaction start? Just for reference, this is an image of the Tang dynasty, greatest extent in the 7th century, around about the late 7th century, so 670s, 680s. And this is an image of the Silk Road, which comes to Damascus and leads off to Egypt and obviously Constantinople with the Byzantine Empire. So again, just to emphasize that question again, where does this interaction start?
From around C635 AD, and the Tang Dynasty, as you mentioned, with the Silk Road. This was a particularly, well, the Chinese would also admit this themselves, a particularly open period in Chinese history with a lot of new ideas coming down the Silk Road. And I mean, this isn't that much time removed from when Buddhism really first started coming to China. That was sort of from AD 200 to 300, around the fall of the Han Dynasty. That was when you get the first proliferation of Buddhist temples first arriving and really spreading out from Chang'an, Xi'an, modern day Xi'an, and rooting itself in China and becoming something quite different from how it started. So this period of sort of around about AD 300 to around AD 600, that was the Southern and Northern dynasties period, a period of fragmentation. And finally, with the restorer of order of the Tang Dynasty, is a period in which a lot of ideas enter China and take root. And the Nestorians came to the Tang Dynasty, but they were as traders, and mostly in the big city in Xi'an. They didn't really make that much of an imprint elsewhere, although I believe there are steles that record the Nestorians being there. And then, of course, after that is the Mongol takeover with the Yuan dynasty, and we all know about the stories of Marco Polo and the so-called Semu peoples who helped out the Mongols hold power over the Chinese at that time. So we're really talking about, yes, back to the Tang Dynasty, 635 AD. That's where it really first takes root in China.
But just to emphasize, when we're talking about Nestorianism, we're really talking about Oriental Christianity. At one point, this was known as the Persian variety of Christianity, the church in Persia. And this also spurs on the imagination in the West about the tale of Prester John. I guess one question I'd like to ask you before moving on to the Ming Dynasty, which is, we know that the Tang Dynasty established some form of communication with the Eastern Roman Empire, with the Byzantine Empire. So would there have been any other Christian interaction, denominations interacting with the Chinese other than the Nestorians and the Oriental Christians?
There's not much evidence of much communication outside of that. Just to give you an idea of how little the West knew about China when Matteo Ricci arrives, and we're talking about someone who received one of the best educations one could receive. The Jesuits at that time had mathematicians like Clavius. So if China was well known to people, they would, for example, have known that the Chinese write right to left, not left to right. But Matteo Ricci was discovering that for himself. So there's not much evidence of communication between the Tang Dynasty and the Ming. As far as my reading goes, the Ming Dynasty and Matteo Ricci's and the Jesuits' entry to China is really the first real meeting point between Christianity. If we put aside Nestorianism, it is really the first meeting point between China and Christianity proper.
That's, again, very interesting, because someone in the chat is mentioning Marco Polo. During the 14th century, you mentioned the Mongols. Well, the Yuan dynasty ruled over China, and the Mongols had subsections of their empire ruling over Russia. And of course, Russia is very Christian and was allowed to keep its religion despite being dominated and having to pay tribute towards the Great Khan, the Golden Khan in Sarai, which is near modern-day Volgograd, used to be called Stalingrad. So even with that connection, say, for example, Eastern Orthodoxy wouldn't have had a look in seriously in China before the Catholics.
No, there's little evidence of that. There was no Christianity in China at all when Matteo Ricci arrives. It was completely, I mean, perhaps part of it is to do with the chaos of that era. There isn't really much in terms of opportunity for those Orthodox to make inroads into China. The Mongol dynasty, as it played out in China, was a pretty awful time period for most Chinese. And they were very keen on keeping everyone separate, not really having anyone coming in. So you'd get this atmosphere in China of at the time of each Chinese village or Chinese town ruled over by a general, and the upper echelons would have been Mongol, with each area becoming like an island in a way to cut off any possibility for any Chinese uprising. At least that worked until Zhuyanzhang. So I don't get the impression from the Chinese record that there was really much interaction with the Orthodox at all. Most Chinese people were coming to Matteo Ricci with, it was a novelty, a complete novelty to them. Even with the experience of Marco Polo in China, Christianity doesn't take any roots. I don't think Marco Polo even learned Chinese. He may have learned a little bit, but he was working with the Mongols mostly. So, yes, this is really the first time Christianity makes any imprint on China at all.
I think the major difference would be because obviously the Yuan dynasty were familiar with Islam and patronized the construction of certain mosques. is that the other three corners of the Mongol Empire, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Golden Horde, all at one point converted to Islam. So the Muslims, of course, had a profusion into Western China. So that legacy still survives. And ironically, again, we're talking about the profusion of Christianity. Within the Ilkhanate, the conversion of the Ilkhans to Islam basically quashed Nestorianism as having any sort of political relevance thereafter. So it again would be consistent with the Islamification of much of the Mongol Empire to implement prescriptions on the spread of missionaries and Christian worship, if you have any familiarity with how Muslim states tend to operate. So I really want to now bring us to the context of the Ming dynasty, very sort of briefly, what is the Ming dynasty and what sort of state was it in by the time that the Portuguese and the Spanish arrived?
Well, the Ming dynasty had lasted almost 250 years by that point. And it's won on horseback by Zhu Yuanzhang, who kicks out the Mongols by 1368 after rising up through the Red Turban Rebellion and reclaiming Chinese rule in China. But by this time, after a very long period of stability, by and large, and a restoration of mostly Confucian and legalist tendencies in governance, especially with the founder Zhu Yuanzhang, who was a legalist in all but name, the emphasis on strict punishments and generous rewards was something that he certainly emphasized. But over time, as it tends to be with with Chinese dynasties, it happens time and time again. The Confucians come in and consolidate power and keep things stable. But things degenerate, as they always do in history. And by this time, when Matteo Ricci arrives in China, the Wanli emperor had been in power for about 10 years, from 1572. Now, this started out very well.
Just before I get to that point, there's another interesting facet about the Ming dynasty, which is that from 1405 onwards, I'm sure someone in the chat would mention it if we failed to mention it. Zheng He begins his great maritime voyages throughout most of Indochina and reaching parts of India and sort of reaching as far as East Africa, modern day Mozambique and Somalia, around about the sort of Indian port of Calcutta in the south. And again, this is an interesting note that the Chinese, had they kept up that maritime spirit, which sort of evaporated by the time around the 1440s, 1450s, that they could have essentially met the Portuguese half a century later on equal terms as fellow explorers, but alas, that didn't happen.
Indeed, that was a high point of the Ming dynasty. It's worth bearing in mind, everyone, and I skipped over the sort of 250 years between the founding of the dynasty under Zhu Yuanzhang and this point for the sake of expediency. But yes, this is the dynasty in which the iconic Great Wall, that when we envision it in our minds, when we imagine it, it is mostly the Ming dynasty's creation, and of course the Forbidden City as well. So this is a dynasty with solid accomplishments by the time Wanli Emperor's very long reign, unfortunately, brings things to a standstill. But yes, it is interesting to consider about the expansion under Zheng He. The nature of that voyage was really more to receive tribute and sort of look into where they could get tribute from, rather than expansion necessarily. They had huge junks that were very much bigger than European ones of the exact same time, but they were they were just there to go to the the Horn of Africa and receive tribute and then go back. They didn't really have a plan to expand, although had they continued it, yes, they would have met the Portuguese, I suppose, with a very different energy, as opposed to being static where they were when the Portuguese arrived in Macau.
And so, as it happened, rather than the Chinese being the instigators of a new maritime commercial empire in the Indian Ocean, instead that would be left to the Portuguese. The Portuguese established their base in Goa, obviously, in addition to other bases dotted throughout the coastline of India. They established another base in Malacca. And by the time we have the Portuguese establishing themselves in Macau, the Spanish are also establishing a protectorate over the Philippines. So they're almost surrounded, the Chinese, on all fronts by the what will be after the year 1580, the Portuguese-Chinese Empire, the Portuguese-Spanish Empire. And that empire will again try to make inroads into Japan as well. So why, just before getting to the Wanli Emperor, why would the Chinese give the Portuguese a concession in Macau?
By that point, things
Because
had
for reference,
really degenerated. Yes.
because for reference, this is near 1557, so 15 years before Wanli enters into power, and a quarter of a century effectively before Matteo Ricci comes in.
Yeah, by that point, they were, even putting aside the Wanli Emperor's reign, even before that, it was a civilization in its autumn. I'm not quite sure the particulars as to why they gave the Portuguese Macau specifically. But yeah, by that point, they had the pirates on the eastern seaboard, I know, at the same time, which the General Ji Qiguang was dealing with. I think that may have drawn their attention away.
Again, it's interesting. This was confirmed in a formal agreement. It's called the Luso-Chinese Agreement of 1554, and that obviously allowed the establishment of a trading center. But traditionally, Western trade is always focused in that area around the Pearl River, Canton in particular. It'll later be the base for the British in Hong Kong in the 1840s. So that seems to be, again, the nexus of Western trade throughout China. But again, like we see with the Japanese in Nagasaki, it's also a way for the Chinese to, I would say, exact the benefits of having interaction with the outside whilst essentially being able to control trade and the flow of information through one specific port, as opposed to inviting, again, the prospects of Portuguese raiding along with the Japanese pirates, etc. So regarding,
Yes, a brief note on that. I do recall that, given the nature of the geography of that place, it was quite easy to wall off that section, and a wall was put up by the governor. And now, thinking back to it, I do remember that even though the territory is handed over informally, they still officially, the governor of Guangzhou was still officially the governor of the Macau territory, which gave them reason to keep their very close eyes on the trading port that was there. And they also became very suspicious because the Portuguese started building very large stone buildings that they hadn't seen, of the kind they hadn't seen before, which became churches. I believe that the Chinese at the time thought they were some kind of military facility. But yes, I think part of it is because Macau is just this cut off peninsula, much like in the way Hong Kong is, that can easily be ceded to allow for trade through very narrow means on the other side to China, whilst allowing for it to go on whilst preventing them from making further incursions.
And of course, this was a nexus towards not just Catholicism within China, but Catholicism within the entire region, to the point that the papacy actually establishes its own diocese for Macau in the year 1576. So, would you like to give us a little bit of the backstory of Matteo Ricci, who is again this figure who looms so large over the history of Catholic Confucian interaction during this period? Of all the missionaries, in particular the Jesuit missionaries during this period, it all tends to focus on the figure of Matteo Ricci. Would you like to give us a very brief introduction as to where he came from before he arrived in China?
He was born in Macau in 1552. At that time, it was a papal state. I believe he had 13 brothers and sisters, so he's part of a very large family. And I think some of the other ones went into the priesthood as well. And he ended up joining the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, in 1571 at the Roman College. And as mentioned earlier, he studied under Clavius, a very impressive mathematician and astronomer at that time. By 1577, he applied to that missionary in the Far East. And I think whilst he was in Lisbon, he met King Sebastian at the time. I remember reading about that, and him having been very impressed by the man who would end up dying battle in Morocco, I think it was.
Unless you're one of these people who believe that he simply vanished and Portugal still has to await the return of the king.
Yes, I heard
yes,
about that one. Yeah.
but yes, that this is a climatic event that actually allows for the situation to develop where the Spanish and the Portuguese are ruled over by the same king, Philip II. So it's a momentous occasion in European history.
Yes, it was. Right. And he wrote about King Sebastian many years later, and was very sad that he'd passed away. And I believe he was on a voyage on the way to Goa at the time when he heard about it. Or he either on the way, or he'd stopped off somewhere, I believe in Mozambique, at a little trading port that they had there, and found out about it. And I believe they held a special mass for it in Requiem.
Well, again, he would have been the king of Portugal, so it would have been very strange if they didn't hold masses for the delivery of the king to heaven. But he arrives in China. It actually comes off the back of that interaction with a figure who I mentioned very prominently in a previous stream, which people want to look at, which is Japan's Catholic century. The head of the Jesuit mission there was Alessandro Valignano, and Matteo Ricci was actually his subordinate in coming to China. But it's very interesting how Matteo Ricci adopts a very, I would say, ultimately a politically conducive strategy given the situation that we find in China at the time. You've already alluded to that friction between the legalistic and Confucian elements within the government, but another friction is between the Confucian, the Buddhist, and the Taoist elements within China as well. I think it's again interesting to note that regardless of what the Enlightenment mindset likes to prefigure onto China, that these are all, happy religions, all interconnected in some way, which have this harmonious relationship, given the very fractious and factional nature of Chinese internal politics, especially in the last century of the existence of Ming. Again, this is nothing more than a romantic view of Chinese history. But this article is by Yu Liu, The Intricacies of Accommodation, the Proselytizing Strategy of Matteo Ricci, which is very interesting. And this establishes, again, the political context for which someone like a Matteo Ricci could thrive. Whereas if you look to, by comparison, Alessandro Valignano in Japan, the great victory for the Japanese Catholic missions was being able to pick off certain lords in one island in Japan, Kyushu, in particular the Lord of Bungo, Atomo, to propagate the Catholic mission within Japan, albeit when we have the unification with Hideyoshi and ultimately with the Tokugawa shogunate, there are increasing prescriptions against Catholicism in Japan in particular. So, as with everything, the strategy for the Jesuits again is to attach themselves to the greatest political authority, being that of the Wanli Emperor himself. And the article goes as follows. Coming to the throne when he was only 9 years old, the Wanli Emperor was fortunate in the first 10 years of his reign to have the service of a capable, though authoritarian Confucius scholar, official named Zhang Zhusheng, who, as a strict and stern taskmaster, was also his personal tutor. What do you think of Zhang Zhusheng in particular?
Yeah, I certainly had legalist tendencies. He emphasized the need for a new land tax registry to make sure that they were getting the proper tax that they were due. This hadn't been done since the founder, Zhu Yanzhang. So this is a long period of time of having not readjusted their tax registry. And he made sure that the taxes due to them were received, and there was no flexibility or amelioration that was allowed to let slide before under other chancellors. So he represents in some ways the limits of what a very determined legalist can do mid-dynasty, as opposed to forming a dynasty like a Shanyang or a figure like Zhu Yanzhang. And it becomes very clear as soon as he dies in 1572 just how effective he was, because after that was really when the Wanli Emperor begins to mistrust everyone, because his follower, or the person who came after him as the chancellor, one Jiang Siwei, plays a part in convincing everyone that Zhang Zhuzhen had been a traitor and had manipulated his position for his personal gain. The Wanli Emperor after that starts to mistrust everyone and backs away and retreats away into passions of concubines and so on. And that is where the succession crisis happens, with the third male son born to him, who shouldn't be the heir apparent. He wanted that son of the Lady Zheng, as she's known, to be the heir apparent, but mostly Confucian mandarins did not want that. They wanted the firstborn son to be the inheritor of the throne. And this leads us to this very telling audience that he has in 1590, if you would indulge me in reading this very briefly, between the Jiang Siwei, the chancellor after the pictured Zhang Zhuzheng there. So this is the emperor on February the 5th, 1590, an audience with that chancellor there. I'm afraid that my illness has become incurable. And there's the chancellor coming back. Please don't say that, Your Majesty. You are in the prime of your life, full of pep and vitality. All Your Majesty needs is a good rest and some good care. In no time, you will get over it. And the emperor comes back again. Oh, last year, because of the fire element that rose from the heart and the liver, I constantly had this congestion in the chest and dizziness in my head. And this repeats itself through the audiences he has. He's constantly making excuses to not take part in the daily court proceedings, making excuses like this. And this really paralyzed the whole regime, because at the end of the day, it was still on the emperor to make decisions, particularly given the fact that if emperor made a decision and things went wrong, it was always blamed on the execution. It was the execution that went wrong rather than the emperor's decree. So if you're a Mandarin and you're in this situation where you have to make a decision, but the emperor is not going to say anything about the matter, and you're going to be punished if it goes wrong, and you're going to be punished regardless, because you're going to do this thing without the emperor's approval, and it could potentially come back to haunt you. So you have this bureaucracy at the top that's completely paralyzed by the time Ricci starts gaining a foothold in China after 1582. This situation that I gave there, that audience with the emperor, was fairly typical of the top at the time. So you have people and the mandarins all over China pretty much paralyzed at this point without being able to do anything with any confidence, at least.
Just to add a bit of context again to the figure of Zhang Zhusheng, he was the patron, again, just based on my limited knowledge of Ming history. I know he was the patron of Qi Guang, who was the inaugurator of the reconstruction of large parts of the Great Wall, much of the design of the Great Wall that we currently see. So this is the period from the late 1560s to the 1570s. So again, corresponding with the earlier period of the Wanli Emperor, where he isn't in this permanent state, you can say, of feigned or real incapacity or debauchery. So it seems again for a brief moment that there could have been this this restoration of elements and reform of the Ming dynasty, had it not essentially been for this paralysis that comes after the great chancellor's death. And this is where the article continues. After Zhang's death in 1582, he quickly turned delinquent the Wanli Emperor in the exercise of the highly centralized governmental power that was vested in him. Because he simply refused for years to see the highest-ranking Confucian scholars who prepared various suggestions and policies for him to sign into imperial edicts, he gradually paralyzed the routine administration of the entire government by blocking normal appointments, transfers, leaves, retirements, and disciplinary actions, and by delegating instead large numbers of eunuchs to the provinces of his personal tax commissioners. It is this very unusual situation that gave someone like Ricci a chance. In spite of his implausible Christian reading of Confucianism, reform-minded scholar officials embraced him as an ally against eunuchs who were generally followers of Buddhism and Taoism, accepting his word about his religious faith as consistent with an old Confucian ideal of respecting, fearing, and serving heaven. They also welcomed his scientific knowledge as useful in their championship of pragmatic or utilitarian learning over the subjectivist and individualist theories of Wan Yang Ming and Li Ji, and they considered to be self-indulgent and socially harmful, and over the purely philosophical and literary studies of the Neo-Confucian Li or Kui that they regarded as vain and useless. Among Ricci's most important converts were Qu Guangqi, Li Zhizhao, and Yang Tingyun, baptized as Paul, Leo, and Michael, respectively, and known as the three pillars of the early Chinese Christian church, all of them distinguished Confucian scholars and high officials in the Ming government. Qu and Li were the first attracted to Ricci by his knowledge of mathematics and cartography, while Yang, a disillusioned Buddhist, was attracted by his ethical and religious teachings. Whatever made them initially interested in Christianity, they all ended up seeing Ricci's doctrine about the Lord of Heaven, and they palpably used scientific and ethical learning of Europe as closely connected with each other and equally worthy of promulgation in the Middle Kingdom. While learning about the faith, as Qu Guangqi said, I came to understand how it can supplement Confucianism and fight against Buddhism, and how, in addition, it involves a way of investigating things and scrutinizing reason, which may provide the answer to every question both inside and outside this world. Through the study of this book, as Li Zhizhao similarly remarked in his preface to a Jesuit treatise, one comes to know heaven, so that one can make sense of the world of creation, the necessity of a maker for the made things, the deliberation of the creator. Feeling for the Li and the grasping of the Tao, he went on to point out, one can then thoroughly understand reason and even destiny. Here, for Qu and Li, as elsewhere for Yang, what Ricci taught was not some practical learning useful only for certain isolated local problems, but a new way of totalizing thinking, essentially for the moral and spiritual renovations of individuals and societies. Again, what I find fascinating is that, in complete contradistinction to what's happening in China, in Japan, you have a series of not just erudite and effective leaders, but you can say great men of history, that being Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, which is almost unheard of in history to have three great men succeeding from one another. And so they have a very proactive interpretation of what sort of religion is going to be permitted in Japan. And towards around the year 1615, Tokugawa Ieyasu has his own unique conception of Shintoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism all integrated into a state religion, which I've elsewhere basically stated as Shintoism being almost an Eastern version of what we see later with Anglicanism. But what we have in China is the complete opposite. We have a useless leader in a system which is incredibly centralized. And yet, as a result of the incapacity of the ruler and the duration of that rule, it effectively allows for someone like a Jesuit missionary to reach the highest echelons of power and affect a religious policy with almost no direct oversight from the emperor himself. And so it allows essentially this situation where there's already this political conflict brewing between the Confucian literati and the eunuch factions within the court, which allows for some Confucians to embrace Matteo Ricci, not just for the elements of religious, again, inducement founded on things such as the application of reason and the whole notion of creation, but you further again elaborate on the aspects of scientific learning he brings in from the West, Portuguese knowledge of cartography, mathematics. Indeed, the treatise that you can see, the image I have on the left here, is a copy of Euclid's Elements, Euclidean geometry. So all of this information is useful to certain learned Confucian scholars. And as we later see, as you'll be very aware, we have Jesuit missionaries and a Jesuit presence in China all the way up until, really, you can say, the Qianlong era throughout most of the 18th century. And there is that element which exists in the background, albeit the element of proselytizing recedes ever further, especially towards the 18th century. But what do you think again about that idea, which is brought up here by Yu Liu, about this essentially being a political contest between the Buddhists and the Confucians, and how Christianity was able to sneak in as a result?
I get the impression from my reading of the letters and the experiences of Ricci himself is that, as you mentioned, because the center isn't willing to make decisions, you get various regional mandarins like Wanpan, for example, who invites Ricci to Jiaoqing in 1583 in September. So it seemed to depend upon the particular proclivities of whatever governor was in the area at the time. So, for example, pretty soon after that, in 1589, a new governor comes in and removes Ricci from Jiaoqing, and he has to go to another city, Xiaozhou, also known as Xiaoguan. But as to why he could make inroads all the way up to Beijing without seemingly any resistance, well, he does face resistance at some points. For example, he is booted out of Jiaoqing, and as that map shows there, and that's quite a good map to show, the one on the right shows that at various periods he's obviously trying to move further north towards Beijing, but he's flitting between these places quite often, largely dependent upon the whims of the governor in that area. So that's the furthest south dot there, that's Jiaoqing. And then in the middle there, the middle dot, that's Shaoguan. And then the furthest north dot there, that's Nanchang, where he lived. So he's flitting around between places, depending on whether the governors would let him stay or not. And whether or not this was taken advantage, was this politically, I'm not sure about that, because he doesn't seem to play into what anyone wants. It's just that there's a power vacuum with no one making decisions, and some literates come to him, and a fair few do, because they're at first impressed by the cartography that he has, but then later on they become, and the science, and an object that surprised me was that they were very, very impressed by prisms. And Matteo Ricci was very often trying to order them in from Venice, just simple prisms. That was something that they didn't have access to in such a way that they did in Italy at the time. Yeah, the overall impression from the letters seems to be it just depended on the literati of that area. And he does get a fair few to him, like the Chu Guanqi you mentioned, and Li Zhi, who he is very impressed by him. There's a quote here that I've got about Li Zhi writing on Matteo Ricci. It's a brief one. Now he can speak our language fluently, write our scripts, and act according to our rules of conduct. He is an extremely impressive man, a person of inner refinement, outwardly most straightforward, in an assembly of people all talking in confusion, with each holding to his own point of view. Ricci keeps his silence, and cannot be provoked to interfere or to become involved. Amongst the people of my acquaintance, no one is comparable to him. All those who are either too overbearing or too flattering, or those who parade their cleverness, or are narrow-minded and lacking in intelligence, are inferior to him. This is not an uncommon impression that people get of Matteo Ricci at the time, and he has a fair few patrons. But what I don't see is a pattern of a particular faction coming to his side for whatever reason. I see are some literates coming to him because they've interacted with him and been impressed by the science that he brings, and the ideas of God that he brings, and how much he's learned about Chinese culture and history, and learned to realize that in many ways, as we mentioned before, Confucius does come to a form of the natural law, and he comes as far to God as Aristotle does in some ways. So I don't see a pattern of a faction coming to him. I see a pattern of literates, for whatever reason, and this could be God's will, coming to him and finding God, and helping him at many stages to keep him in places. But he doesn't, and we'll get to this later, but he doesn't get a lot of support in the capital as he would have hoped to meet the emperor. That didn't happen in the end.
I think, again, in terms of the Jesuit strategy, again, we can't distance the Jesuit strategy from having implicit political aims, because the Jesuit strategy was not only to appeal directly to the top and then essentially allow for the permit of missionary work to encroach below. Essentially, if we see Japan as a model, especially in the 1570s and the 1580s, the model essentially was, again, to establish the conditions for toleration, the creation of churches, and in terms of the Jesuits also being able to ingratiate themselves. So, for example, a key issue for Matteo Ricci was over which dress to appropriate. So he begins by wearing Buddhist dress, and then later is essentially discovered that this is actually not very conducive towards his aims, and that he would again acquire a greater prestige by adopting Confucian dress. And again, this is on the explicit direction of the missionary general in this region, Alessandro Vallegnano. And indeed, Vallegnano's work in Japan had basically exposed that a line needed to be, a very thin line needed to be drawn between respecting the local customs and not being able to de facto apostatize from the Catholic faith. So in the case of Japan, it was explicitly over Buddhist rituals, ancestor worship, the proper deference essentially that one shows to the ruler's religion, and when it'll be very convenient or politic to excuse oneself from that situation, being able to deal with elements of syncretism and malformed Christian teachings, Bible translations, especially for bringing in new vocations into the church, was a major issue for Japanese and indeed Chinese converts. The association of certain Chinese words for God, for example, as opposed and distinct from the idea of the Christian God, and how, again, these are liable for misinterpretation. When we're talking about a religion which has a very, again, firm understanding of what the truth is, this is after the Tridentine reforms as well, in terms of reclarifying these positions. The popes and the missionaries within all of these areas were, again, keen to emphasize that thin line where one can draw towards political accommodation and, like I said, de facto apostasy. And Matteo Ricci, as far as I can see, was very involved in that position. And within the whole framing of the Catholic faith, he was more controversial than Valeriano, who himself was the target of a lot of criticism from the Franciscans, from the Dominicans, from the Augustinians, when the general mission in Japan, say, for example, the Jesuit mission lost that sole right for proselytizing around about the year 1600. And so all of these other missionaries were allowed to establish a presence within Japan. And of course, we have the other political dynamic, the major political dynamic, which is that the mission in the Philippines was explicitly associated with the idea of launching a military enterprise into China. So from the Catholic and from the Spanish point of view, all of these ideas are going on simultaneously. And again, the Jesuit missions were to a greater or lesser extent aware of these plans. As in the case of the whole idea of the Chinese enterprise, it actually reached again a form of tacit approval from the governor of the Philippines, and had reached the court in the councils of the Indies of the court of Philip II. So politics and the whole nature of the Japanese mission, not just politics in terms of accommodation with the Chinese, but politics in the Catholic Church internally and within the secular arm of the church, which of course was the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire. I don't think any of this can effectively be denied. And it's why I brought up again the comparison earlier with Pietro Parolin, and saying that these political elements are as controversial today regarding China as they were in the early 17th century, and they're going to form again, you can say, an epilogue for this discussion. So I think it's time, really. I have again an extension of that article by Liu, which talks about more about this interaction and this verging on syncreticism with Confucianism and the Catholic Church. And as with everything else, feel free to interject, because it's roughly around 4 pages, and a lot is brought up in this rather concise reading, James. Ricci's particular approach to his missionary work has recently attracted 2 influential, though clearly conflicting, interpretations. On the one hand, Ricci's deliberate enlistment of ancient Chinese texts in the service of his evangelism won admiration from scholars such as David E. MUNGELLO. He's a scholar who I've cited directly in the description as well, in terms of the overall understanding of the historiography, modern historiography of this period. Evidently having in mind how well Ricci was received by the educated Chinese of the late Ming dynasty, including those who did not mutually accept his Christian teachings, and how some of the Chinese writings, including his major proselytizing work, were later even included in the Imperial Library of Preserved Books collected during the Qianlong period. So this is most of the 18th century of the Qing dynasty. MUNGELLO construes this accommodation policy as based on a brilliant insight, which not only accorded with contemporary reality, but also meddled with what little was known of high Chinese antiquity, and appealed to the Chinese reverence of antiquity. On the other hand, Ricci's conspicuous effort to make his European religion somewhat native in China through his manipulation of canonical works in Chinese antiquity has been considered by some as disingenuous or perceptive by scholars such as Jacques Genet. Citing fundamental and irreconcilable differences of China and Europe in philosophical and religious thinking, Genet presents Ricci's well-publicized alliance with Confucianism as nothing but an enterprise of seduction. As much as his complex juggling of simultaneous approval and repudiation concerning Confucianism, Ricci's painstaking appropriation of Chinese classics for his ecclesiastical purposes was a very important aspect of his missionary work in China, while the former proves in the actual turn of events to be one of the most important legacies. However, the latter did not. Now, this again is an important aspect, is because this essentially is striking on a fundamental, which is Jesuitical thinking, which is the heart one presents to the world and the heart that one keeps buried in secret. The whole notion that the Jesuit is outwardly trying to conform and appeal to the society in which he's essentially trying to proselytize to, while simultaneously being deliberately disingenuous and harboring a hidden agenda. It's this explicitly Jesuitical thinking which enraptured the minds of the Metsuke and the Japanese counterintelligence agents, and indeed the whole sort of mentality around the Japanese shogunate for centuries, that ensured that no Catholic missionaries could come to Japan at all. And the Protestant missionaries, the Dutch missionaries who were allowed to maintain a confined quarters in Nagasaki, had to ritually stamp on icons of the Virgin Mary. So again, when we're talking about politics regarding the Jesuits, all of my sort of interpretation is that regardless of how devout their their religious leanings are, and I'm not necessarily doubting that, the political element always has to be considered, not just again from the view of the Catholic mission in general, but the perception that there was an overall political goal associated with the missionary project. And if you look at the idea of the Spanish enterprise taking over China, which, like I said, it gained serious traction up until the Spanish Armada in 1588. These things have to be taken into consideration. I've been speaking quite a lot, and again, I've been speaking about the political angle of this quite sort of rigorously, but I'd like to sort of, again, bring you in, James, and ask for your thoughts.
Well, I sometimes get the impressions that there's a uncharitable interpretation of what Matteo Ricci did sometimes. And I think a lot of this stems from the fact that letters sometimes took many years to arrive to the Vatican. Sometimes they were lost entirely. So a lot of what the Franciscans accused him of was a lot of it was based on what they're saying he did rather than perhaps what he did. So, for example, I hear about the accusation that he accommodated too much and adopted too much of the pagan customs. Well, here's a letter right from Matteo Ricci himself in 15. And I know we've got to put aside the fact that this is his side of events, but I suppose it's the side that we don't seem to hear much from. So here's his letter to Giovanni Battista Ricci, his father, in 1605. He's speaking of his converts. So he's referring to an old man of 72 who he converted. And we had this man burning many, and I quote, "We had this man burning many images of idols and 3 trunks of books, which contained illicit things, to which he attended before being baptized." They did have, it comes across from Matteo Ricci's letters that they did have standards that they were trying to apply. And there's another one here that I've got describing when they received the polyglot Bible from Europe. The Polyglot Bible, that is this very grand, beautifully written, illustrated Bible. And I'm just trying to find the quote here. I can't find it right now, but I remember the gist off the top of my head. It's into one of the letters. Ah, here it is. I've got it. So this is when he sets out this beautiful illustrated Bible that they've been waiting so many years to receive from it's otherwise known as the Plantin Bible, printed in Antwerp between 1569 and 1572 for King Philip of Spain. And they received this Bible, and it's a great day because they were worried that they would lose it on the way, the great voyage that many ships would be lost in over from Goa and from Portugal. And this is the day it finally arrives. And although it got a little wet, it is, and I quote, "And although it got a little wet, it is still very handsome and intact. And all day we show it to the Chinese who come to see it only for worship and its ornamentation, which puts them in awe of our holy law. The first day that we showed it to the Christians was our solemn feast day, I believe the Assumption of Our Lady, in which I said the conventional Mass, with the usual solemnity. And at the end of it, I took the cowl and placing the Bible in the middle of the church on a table." By the way, this is Ricci in the time in Beijing. "Sensed it in front of the Christians with whom we knelt to give thanks to God for having sent to this kingdom his holy law set down in those sacred books. And these are the best ornaments of my room, where the leading figures of the court and consequently of the whole realm came to see us, with one side of the chest fitted with Chinese books and the other side with our own, which by their gold and outward splendor well mark the difference that there is between them." End quote. We get this impression of a man clearly attempting to differentiate between pagan practices and his own Bible that he'd so long wanted to see in China. This is, by the way, this has come in the context of Matteo Ricci having very few personal belongings after so many moves between Jiaoqing and Shaoguan. He finally gets this handsome Bible, and he's so pleased that he shows it in the church and differentiates it from the Chinese books. He puts the Confucian books to one side and their own to the other in the middle, and the emphasis on the gold and splendor of their own books. So I wonder whether some of this from the Franciscans was uncharitable. I mean, from Ricci's letters, I don't see much evidence of him being too accommodating. And what else did they accuse him of? Diluting the faith? Well, I don't see any evidence for that, because he would, in his own letters, claim to refuse people being baptized should they continue practicing polygamy, for example. They did have standards, and I wonder to what extent the Franciscan accusations were uncharitable.
Regarding the images, just while we're on the topic, you sent me these 3 images in preparation for the stream. For reference, these images are contained within the book The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci by J.D. Spencer. Again, the link is in the description. But would you like to describe these images and what relevance essentially they have for the missionary work?
I'm muted. There we go. So these were produced in 1605 by the time Ricci is in Beijing, and he's been on a very long journey by this point, and he's in Beijing finally, and he commissions these for Chen Dayue, making use of what he has, what images he has. So some of them are he's put together different things. So for example, I know that picture of Peter on the waves is 2 pictures together, just because he didn't have a picture of Christ next to a beach, unfortunately. So he had to make do with what he had. So I believe that's a picture from somewhere else. But these were used to spread the faith, to evangelize, to make sense of the Bible with images for people, which were more gripping visually. Then on the left there is the fall from Sodom, the picture that he used to represent that. You see Sodom in the background and the people fleeing it as it's about to be smited. I believe there you can see wind coming in. And then on the furthest right there, you've got the road to Emmaus and Jesus appearing before the disciples there. So these images were used in much the same way as the memory palaces were used to impress upon people the story and make it memorable. That book you mentioned just before, Spence's Memory Palace, really gives a very vivid impression of how these memory palaces were used to impress upon the literati of the time, who they had to memorize hundreds of thousands of pieces of Confucian text for the tests. So being able to memorize and segment things into an order was a skill that many people wanted, and that was one of the reasons why I believe he helped Wan Pan, the governor of Zhaoqing at the time. He helped his son to learn this technique. So this was one of the ways that he used to evangelize, with these images, along with the memory palaces as well, which he would give out for free, for the glory of God, according to his own words.
Just for the sake of the audience, could you briefly describe what exactly a memory palace is?
So it's like a mnemonic. It's like, let's say you arrange a figure with a set of things you want to remember. Like, let's say you want to remember all the parts of the arm, so the bones of a leg, let's say femur, and put them all together with an arrangement so that you remember them. Let's say you want to remember the order of, I don't know, the amount of it's hard to describe. I think it's because us moderns are so unfamiliar with this technique of a memory palace that it's almost, even for me, having read it, admittedly, being an old dog and trying to learn new tricks, it was quite hard for me to actually use it myself. But it's very well described in Spence's book, where you get a figure and the things meaningfully link together to help you remember the separate factoids.
Someone like Giordano Bruno would associate it with essentially trying to understand astrology. He incorporated it within the Hermetic tradition. Another book which is helpful for understanding this is the 1966 book, The Art of Memory, by Francis Yates. In addition, someone like Tommaso Campanella, who is, again, a contemporary scholar who I'm quite fascinated with, wanted to effectively design cities based on this custom of, again, organizing things as astrological units with vivid imagery, all interconnecting with each other. So the city itself essentially would be a memory palace, and thereby everything is referenced to the divine order and God. It's really quite fascinating looking into it. But would you say that Matteo Ricci could actually look at elements of how the Confucian literati were able to study for the civil service examinations, for lack of a better word, and actually believed it could be conducive in terms of being able to bring in new Christian converts in, say, for example, their reading of the Bible and the Catholic Catechism?
Well, at this time, by this point, he'd started translating the 4 books for himself. So he was, at the same time as meeting these literatis who would have memorized these books, he's coming to translate the 4 books for himself. Now, the 4 books, that was Juicy's compilation of the Neo-Confucian that we mentioned earlier, a compilation of Confucian classics, the Analects, the Doctrine of the Mean, the Great Learning. He doesn't put in the Spring and Autumn Annals for some reason. And he adds Munches in there, of course, because that's right up his street. Very convenient, I suppose. So, yes, I think he certainly would have seen the symbiosis that was possible between the Confucian literates needing to memorize all these things and his technique of the memory palace. And it would have all, I suppose, mingled in together with his experience. Remember, he's coming from Macau and he's only there for a year, and there he goes to Zhaoqing and he stays there for 6 years. And this was really his first experimental period. He's adopted the appearance of Buddhist monks, but he quickly realized that this was a miscalculation, and that despite them being revered in some ways, they're not revered as elites. They are off, and it might be helpful to show one of the pictures there, AM, if you don't mind, the picture of the temple and the pagoda there. So yeah, this is the one on the right there. That pagoda is the pagoda in Nanhua in, I think off the top of my head, that's the one in Shaoguan. And I looked on the maps and where exactly that is. It's on the edge of this city. So these were where the Buddhist temples would have been, out in the wilds, in the mountains. So at the beginning, he gets this unfortunate impression that the Buddhists are the most revered because they're the ones near him, and he's been placed in that position on the edge of the town. Whereas, in fact, of course, the Buddhists, despite having their golden age during the Tang and under the only empress in Chinese history, Wu Zetian, who built or just maybe briefly after her reign, the Leshan Dafo, the big Buddha at Leshan, was built, the biggest sitting one in the world. Anyway, so he makes this very unfortunate connection between Buddhism and the revered sages of the country, whereas in fact they are respected but not revered because they're still seen as not the elite. And he identifies from that period onwards the fact that no, he's made a mistake here. The elites are mostly Confucian. So he starts translating these texts from Shaozhou and Zhaoqing onwards, the great 4 books. And by the time he gets to Nanchang, his reputation is preceding him, and people know him as a person of inner refinement by that point. And that's when he meets the scholar Li Zhi in Nanchang, 1595, by this point. So overall, throughout this period, Matteo Ricci's learning about these things. He's having to learn them for himself for the first time as a Westerner or as a Christian. These are things that they had no idea about. So in reading Matteo Ricci's letters and his experiences in China and meeting China where it is in the point in time in 1572, that would have become very clear to him very soon on, because he had a lot to learn. I find it very impressive. It's hard to leave aside my own impressions of this person, but to go from not speaking any Chinese at all to being able to write a treatise on friendship, Zhao Yulun, I think someone in the chat mentioned that earlier, in 1595, a small book of European moral philosophers about love and virtue and friendship. And he writes this in classical Chinese. That's very impressive, only within 13 years of his arrival, of being in China, he could write something in classical Chinese. And yes, certainly that symbiosis and the possibility of converting people via memory palace would have become clear to him by that point.
Again, it's very interesting when we're talking about figures like St. Francis Xavier. Again, when he comes to Japan, one of the difficulties again is translation and the inability to pass such words as fundamental as God and the Christ leads to a huge amount of not only, again, assimilation issues, but religious issues as well. So, from my understanding, it can't really be understated how remarkable these first Jesuits are in terms of being able to learn very quickly the cultures in which they interact. And it's their appreciation, Ricci in China and Vallennano in Japan, is their appreciation of the local cultures that for them, not only the emphasis in terms of a complete learning and understanding of the rituals, customs, and the extant religions and a potential accommodation with them and the local political systems there, but how these are unique systems in terms of the interactions that the Portuguese and the Spanish have had with tribes and governments up until this point. Indeed, Vallennano, for his sake, again, he was the superior to Ricci in many of these interactions, believed that the mission in Japan was the most important Christian mission in the entire world at that point. This, of course, being taken amidst the climactic struggles following on from the Protestant Revolution in 1517. And for Ricci, again, it seems that that impetus towards being able to convert a land which is so politically and culturally refined as China would have that same currency. The pejoratives, which are again launched typically at the other orders, the Augustinians, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and their interactions with the Jesuits, is that they believe that the conversion strategy should follow a similar mold to what happened in the New World. And the extension beyond that is that there should be a compulsion in some instances. Again, that word is reviled by popes and Catholics for obvious reasons. When that sort of thing has to sort of come into common day parlance, is often associated with the idea that the innocence and the moral and intellectual condition of the natives they interact with is lesser than quote unquote sort of white Western Europeans. In the experience of the Jesuits within China and Japan, they cannot make those same contentions. There's no basis for them to make those same contentions. And thereby, their entire attitude towards the great ancient civilizations in which they encountered has to accommodate that. And hence why you can say so much of the way of criticism which is launched against them is the idea that you can have two completely different strategies from converting, say, for example, the populations of Hispaniola, which was one of the first, again, New World conversions, which is very controversial even today and was very controversial at the time. And you had the Sepulveda and the Valladolid debates regarding the whole nature and condition of the natives and their receptibility towards Christian doctrine. And then you contrast that with what's going on in the East. Again, you can take Ricci and be again in awe of the man's learning and cultivation and understanding to some extent of the civilization he interacted with. But now it comes to, you can say, the most important point of all, which is compatibility between Confucianism and Christianity and syncretism, which is the accusation which is often launched against Ricci, the idea that his sympathy towards Confucianism was excessive to the point, again, of compromising basic Christian virtues. And this is going back to the Liu article again, regarding Ricci's claims of the theistic compatibility between Confucianism and Christianity. He who is called the Lord of Heaven in my humble country, Ricci said to his Chinese friend, is he who is called Shang-Ti, the sovereign on high, in Chinese, of all the pagan sects known to Europe. As he similarly told his all-European audiences, I know of no people who fell into fewer errors in the earlier ages of their antiquity than did the Chinese. And again, that's another basis of the moral claims, essentially, that Vallennano in Japan and Ricci would hold for the Chinese, is that part of the advanced state of their civilization, and you can say the moral stature which they assign to them, is again compatible with their reception into the Christian faith, that all of these civilizational ethics again can relate back to Christ and the whole principle of salvation, that these are simply Christians in waiting. From the very beginning of their history, Ricci contended, it is recorded in their writings that they recognized and worshipped one supreme being whom they called the King of Heaven, or designated by some other name indicating his rule over heaven and earth. At first, Ricci's argument for Confucian theism would seem preposterous. After all, the very beginning of Chinese philosophy in the 12th century BC was marked by a clear movement away from an anthropomorphized idea of a deity, and ancient Chinese thinkers never envisioned the origin of the world in terms of what Frederick W. Mote describes, conceptions of creation ex nihilo, by the hands of God, or through the will of God, and all other such mechanistic, teleological, and theistic cosmologies. What they're referring to is the whole basis of creation being creation from nothing. God has created everything, and when they're regarding teleological and theistic cosmologies, that is an explicit reference to Thomas Aquinas' natural theology and the teleological and cosmological arguments for God existence, and the idea, again, from the Catholic point of view, that the existence of the cosmos, the predicate of that is the necessity of a creator, which is the basis for the cosmological argument of God's existence. And that would actually, again, relay to the points you were bringing up earlier, James, regarding the conflation of Confucianism as a religion versus a philosophy. Upon reflection, however, Ricci's theistic readings of Confucianism can be seen as unusually penetrating. Chinese philosophers were always opposed to the notion of the personal God, but they never stopped acknowledging the idea of something that inhered in us and everything else, that served as the anchor and guide of all our moral and physical being, and that at the same time was distinct from anything else, leaving room for tantalizingly for what Kenneth Scott Latourette notes as a tendency towards theism, or what Julia Ching depicts as some kind of rational design which is open or more direct, or a mystical communion. This consistent acknowledgement of something at once in and beyond us cannot but give credence to Ricci's contention of a Confucian form of theism. Again, the issue I find with that in terms of leaning on those arguments is that it falls too much into elements, you can say, of modern sociology and anthropology, which from a Catholic point of view is the illusion of immanence, which is an explicitly condemned doctrine from a Catholic point of view. The idea that the notion of God comes from within, and there isn't therefore the need for an external reality, which is God. But kind of like, again, my reading of Kant in all of this, it seems that Ricci is again trying to find some way of relaying his idea of God to a Confucian understanding in order to have a better frame of reference, in order to be received properly into the faith and have a proper process of catechesis and religious formation. You know, for someone like Kant, the moral imperatives need to be substantiated by an idea in God. For Kant, God isn't a necessity, but God is, again, logically almost necessary in order for there to be a coherent and, you can say, a seductive understanding of us coming to a morality which is formed on reason. Again, I'm summarizing a lot of what I try to uncover regarding Kant's moral philosophy. But as far as I can see, again, just based on that reading segment, Ricci's association with Confucianism and theism doesn't, again, seem to be elevating Confucianism as a religion in its own right, as being compatible, again, with Christianity. But it seems that it's just a way of trying to make Confucianism, you can say, a gateway into a proper Christian understanding, not necessarily sort of overriding Christianity in the process. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I suppose one can only try to meet people where they are.
It's almost quite
And
interesting.
I mean,
Just
can I
yeah,
just finish?
sure.
A lot of people in St. Thomas Aquinas' time also rejected the idea of him, quote unquote, baptizing Aristotle. So to put it bluntly, Ricci seems to be doing the same thing with Confucius, the core of Confucius. Now we must put aside here the Neo-Confucian element that came in after Jushi. Of course, we must put that aside. But the core of Confucianism approaches that of natural law, and as we've discussed earlier, in many ways is reminiscent of Aristotle, particularly Xunzi. So yes, I think that's by and large true, and it's very hard to remember that even people in St. Thomas Aquinas' time rejected him. So, why are you doing this with a pagan? Why are you doing this with a Greek? For many years, and still people do now. So I think what Matteo Ricci is noticing is that at its core, when he's reading the 4 books and he's seeing things like the golden rule there, that I think we've got, have we got on a slide there, AM? But I've got it in front of me anyway. It's from book 15, verse 24 of the Analects. What you do not want done to yourself, do not do unto others. And the core of the repeated refrains throughout the Analects of being benevolent, being quote unquote kind. There's no other really word to translate it as, and I know it sounds quaint, but the Analects goes through many examples of how to do this, and a lot of them are ways of framing behaviors and thought processes without necessarily referring to any sort of religion or theology. Some people have described it as humanist. I'm not sure to what extent I would agree to that, because he does at times refer to there being a Lord of Heaven and a mandate of heaven, indeed. So yes, I think that's by and large true. And I would perhaps take it a step further and say, well, if the ancient Chinese are referring to a god, Shangdi, as the unmoved mover, then there seems to be a lot of symbiosis there. And as I mentioned before, when we give St. Thomas Aquinas the charitable interpretation of trying to baptize Aristotle, why can't Matteo Ricci do that with Confucius? And he seemed to be trying to do that, and bring in, I suppose, a mutual respect forward into any kind of conversion process. It's realizing that these are a people, this is a civilization that, as you mentioned, we're not dealing with a Hispaniola here. We're dealing with an ancient civilization. We're dealing with one that can stand on its own 2 feet and make a good case for itself and its philosophical thinkers throughout history. And as long as it's not the sort of Neo-Confucian flavor that has come to be over time, then it seems uncharitable to deny Matteo Ricci that space to do that.
It's quite interesting, again, you bring up the division, because this article then goes on to say that, again, Ricci was cognizant of that difference. And he goes to say, Ricci, the doctrine most commonly held among the literati at present, he said, seems to me to have been taken from the sect of idols as promulgated about 5 centuries ago. This doctrine, Ricci explained, asserts that the entire universe is composed of a common substance, that the creator of the universe is in one continuous body, a corpus continuum, as it were, together with heaven and earth, men and beasts, trees and plants, and the 4 elements, that each individual thing is a member of the body. From this unity of substance, he would go on to point out, they reason to the love that should unite the individual constituents, and also that man can become like unto God because he is created one with God. This philosophy, Ricci concluded, we endeavour to refute not only from reason, but also from testimony of their own ancient philosophers, to whom they are indebted for all the philosophy they have. Even though he directed his criticism here at the so-called Neo-Confucians of the 12th century, he was in reality confronting the very essence of Chinese philosophy, because this involved a theory of embodying nothing less than what Wing Sit Chan calls a uniquely Chinese brand of humanism. Not the humanism that denies or slights a supreme power, but one that professes the unity of man and heaven. From the very start, Chinese philosophical thinkers were driven by the sense of something at once in and beyond each human being to teach the idea of respecting, fearing, and serving heaven. However, the notion of divinity was never more than what Chang terms a self-existent moral law, with which humanity is inexorably linked as its actual or potential embodiment. The Neo-Confucians may use such terms as Taiji, the great ultimate, Li, the principle, or Qi, the material force, but the substance of their ideas as a conscious synthesis of previous philosophies is the same as the old correspondence of humanity and divinity. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, by and large, yes. And there's one quote here, perhaps that springs to mind. Matteo Ricci is recording a conversation that he has with a Confucian. This is from 1595, letter to Duarte de Sande. And it records his interaction with the Confucian literati. And this man named Sir Zhang, and I'll quote here, Sir Zhang and his disciples, I already had some debates that left them surprised. Sir Zhang is a Confucian literati that he's met. 1595, he would have been in Shaozhou at that time. One day, Sir Zhang, seeing himself cornered on the doctrine, he has discussions with many Confucians, cornered on the doctrine that I had illustrated concerning paradise and hell, which they deny, holding nothing dear but moral virtues and the good of this life, become embarrassed, and said he had nothing more to say about this doctrine except for the words written by a scholar of old, quote, quote within quote, if there is paradise, good men will ascend there, and if there is hell, bad people will descend there. Let's try to be good people and not evil ones. And with this sentence, our dispute came to an end for the time being. Um, I enjoyed that quote personally, because I wish I'd been there in some ways. Very, very fascinating to have been there. Yeah, this encapsulates, I suppose, the gap that it's left in Confucianism for God or not for God, depending on the Confucian, I suppose, or depending on the convert, that is there, but I suppose in a way waiting to find something.
I think it's also interesting just looking at this that not only in order to ingratiate yourself with the Chinese, do you need to understand the language, not only do you need to understand the religious environment, you need to navigate the various parties that you're confronted with to survive, if nothing else, let alone to be able to establish and convert the leadership, which of course is the ultimate aim of the Jesuit missions. But this notion again that Ricci has to become a religious historian of China as well, all of these responsibilities that are incumbent on him in order to center his proselytizing mission. Again, it's quite an accomplishment if you look at it that way.
Yes,
Continuing on,
and in
sorry.
some ways also, pardon me, AM, it's worth bearing in mind that at times this depended on his life, depended on this, depended on him being accepted by the Confucian literati. He suffers an attack in Shaoguan in July 1591, and I've got the quote, page 57. Here it is. Yeah, it's in the other book. 57. Yes. In July 1592, some men who had been gambling in the suburbs of Shaozhou near the boat bridge that connected the main town to the rural area to the west where the Jesuits lived decided to raid the Jesuit residence. They seem to have been incited to make this attack by the priests in a nearby Buddhist monastery, and the priest furnished them with rough and ready weapons, but the Buddhists need not take all the blame. So he suffers this raid that leaves him with a damaged foot, and he walks with a limp for the rest of his life. So at times, this is a man with very little in the way of, he has a few fellow priests, fellow fathers with him, or brothers, and perhaps some novices. But this is a man whose very life depends upon the fact that he's going to get some kind of acceptance by the Confucian literati, who would have been the majority of governors and mandarins at the time. So it's worth bearing that in mind, what the situation he was dealing with no military backing, with very little in terms of support. So he really had to keep the gentry, the literati, on his side, because he nearly paid for it with his life from the Buddhist attack that you can see there.
Increasingly, with the purpose of Macau, as was the intention with Nagasaki, Catholic strategic thinking, not just in terms of the missionary work, is focused on establishing a redoubt from which not just the European settlers and the traders, but even the converts, the Chinese and the Japanese converts respectively, could retreat if this overall conflict would erupt essentially and become the equivalent of pogroms directed against the entire religious community. Of course, as we see in Japan, that comes true with incredibly bloody results. So this notion of security is always an underlying concern for the nature of the missions. And again, why, as beginning with Francis Xavier, there is a heroic aspect of what the missionaries are doing that can't be understated. But again, just continuing on this vein from the theological arguments brought up here by Liu, with an uncanny sense of Confucian theism, Ricci's attack on the theory of humanity's union with heaven brought the dominant Chinese philosophical tradition into contact with Christianity. No matter how perceptive he was about the similarity of China and Europe, he did not and could not find a sympathetic reception for his criticism. For his own purposes, he isolated Neo-Confucian cosmology from Confucius, categorized it as a confusion of ideas from his European perspective. However, just as his literal interpretation of figurative references to the idea of divinity in ancient Chinese texts were unconvincing, his willful application of European logic was also unpersuasive, because the very notion of a union between humanity and divinity already implies a prior distinction of the involved concepts. In the late 16th and early 17th century, there were Chinese thinkers who were critical of Neo-Confucianism, as Ricci was. Li Ji, the ultra-Chinese individualist and arguably the greatest heretic and iconoclast in Chinese history, for instance, ridiculed what he perceived to be a servile Neo-Confucian emphasis on such socially sanctioned values as chastity, righteousness and filial piety, political loyalty. Nevertheless, when using the notion of spontaneity or the infant's heart to conceptualize true morality as inborn, rather than being determined after birth by an external standard, he was drawing inspirations not only from Mencius, but Zen Buddhism and Wang Yangmin's subjectivist version of Neo-Confucianism, but also from the earliest Chinese philosophical beliefs about a self-existent yi as a principle accordance with heaven and earth, which, as explained in a commentary on the doctrine of the mean by the greatest Neo-Confucian philosopher, Zhu Zi, shows clearly how the path of duty is to be traced to the origins in heaven and is unchangeable with the substance of it provided in ourselves and may not be departed from it. Whether having a monotheistic impulse or not, Confucian belief in Tian, or heaven, is not equivalent to a European form of theism, a Christian form of theism, because it is against any anthropomorphized idea of a deity. Whether incompatible with Christianity or not, the dominant Chinese philosophical tradition is also not identical with European atheism or materialism, because it is opposed to any vision of life as spontaneous and causal collision and the multifarious, accidental, random, purposeless congregation and coalescence of atoms. Now, that's taken from a book on the nature of the universe, 1994, but that summary of a rebuke essentially against the idea that the Chinese were in some way atheists, I like, because that's that's a Humean summary and refutation. So as much as the Enlightenment would like to again pull these concepts, we always have to grade them. I've already talked about the distinction between the quote unquote naturalists under Diderot, um, the other sort of the noble savage trope that we see with Rousseau, all the sort of anti-clericalism of Voltaire, which appeals to his sense essentially that the Chinese apparently don't have temples, and of course that's an incredibly romantic and oversimplified view from his aspect. But again, this would seem to be a repudiation of that explicit Humean aspect of the Enlightenment. Since Ricci's theistic approval of Confucianism depended on the manipulation of ancient Chinese texts as much as did his repudiation of it, again, manipulation for the sake, again, of being able to bring people to a Christian point of view. So again, in that sense, it's important to talk about when we talk about perennialism and the modes of historical thought. If he was a history of religions, the idea essentially that he was trying to present Confucianism in a way that was most palatable for a Christian understanding of the world is completely unforgivable, because it is academically subversive. But from his perspective as a missionary, it becomes absolutely necessary and valid. So yes, you can read a sort of nefarious motive in what he's doing and the implications of that having a broader political function. But in order to distinguish him as the historian of religions and him as a missionary, that point needs to be really emphasized. Indeed, if he didn't do that, he would have essentially been called out even more so as a heretic by his religious rivals in the other religious orders. In reality, both of their views, the views of MUNGELLO and Gernot, which talk about these various interpretations of the missionary work, provide some issues with Ricci's overall aims. His contentious claim of Confucian theism, and with his Christian criticism of Neo-Confucian cosmology, to be specific, which he apparently grasps something crucially important about the ambiguous contrast of China with Europe in philosophical and religious thinking. Few, if any, of those Chinese scholarly officials he attempted to proselytize did or could accept his unmistakably European and therefore foreign interpretation of Chinese classics. When his particular use of accommodation as an evangelizing policy became contested in the early 17th century, his opponents within the Jesuit order most prominently cited this fact against him. His strategy of turning one version of Confucianism against another might have looked good on paper, that being the idea of rescuing Confucianism from its Neo-Confucian corruption. But since it was unpersuasive to the Chinese, it is hard to see how it can, in reality, be categorized as brilliant, as someone like MUNGELLO would advocate, since his willful appropriation of canonical Chinese works for his own purposes was unconvincing to the Chinese. It is also hard to see how it can be conceptualized as deceptive, as Gernot describes it. And again, Gernot is just repeating the trope in many ways about Jesuitical thinking and Jesuitical duplicity. But there is a point that has to be made here. You know, we're talking about, you can say, the individual genius of Matteo Ricci, but what success arguably can he point to? I mean, you talked about his experiences in Beijing. From my understanding, when he was allowed to come to Beijing as a result of an invitation granted him by the Wanli Emperor in around about the year 1600, he was not again sought as a missionary to convert the emperor by any means. No, he was again relied on for his scientific and astronomical learning. And so, yes, you can see a lot of political and sort of conceptual adroitness in a figure like Matteo Ricci. But I really want to ask you this question: how successful was his effort, and if anything, what legacy, if any legacy, can be ascribed to him within China and within the Chinese Christian community?
Well, that's a tough question. I've thought about this quite a lot myself, and it's sometimes things don't happen at the right time, although that they might be the right answer. And I'm not saying that Matteo Ricci's strategy was completely perfect or without fault, but what I am saying is that perhaps an evolution could have happened there, but didn't, because, well, the Ming Dynasty was pretty soon to fall after that and was already in its civilizational autumn. By the time Ricci dies in 1609, having tried to attempt to get to the Wanli Emperor, remember the Wanli Emperor had already spent 20 years recusing himself of any kind of making any kind of decision, and soon after his death, the Ming Dynasty fell to a barely literate people who'd only been literate 3 years before, the Manchus, and again, we have a period of, well, there not being Chinese rule in China, effectively. So it's, and then the whole wheels of history start turning again, don't they? Because the Kangxi Emperor gives the Jesuits permission to proselytize, but like you said, by Qianlong, they're removed, and that's not long after. I think that's well, no, that is quite a long time afterwards, actually. 16 Kangxi Emperor would have been late 1600s, and Qianlong is in the mid 1800s, isn't he? So
I think I'm sort of focusing on the
Mhm.
more immediate results,
Well,
because
to be fair to Ricci, Xu Guangqi, one of his converts, does become a very prominent man in Chinese history. He becomes a chancellor after Ricci had died. He becomes the secretary to the Ministry of Rites in 1623, and collaborated with the astronomers at that time to produce a correction of the Chinese calendar. By 1632, he becomes the Grand Secretary. So within one generation of Matteo Ricci passing away and his descendants, we do get some success up at the top. But yes, not a blossoming of Christianity in China as he would have hoped. And
well,
yet,
sorry.
yeah, and yet that mission lasts until the Qianlong Emperor, doesn't it? But then by that time, we're in a very different situation once more, and it's all sort of it's very hard to tell by that point what legacy he's left. Well, we've got one, for example, one image right there. We've got the image of the church in Beijing of the Immaculate Conception. So that's one thing. And also in Sichuan, also in the southwest, a lot of Catholics, and a very, very large church that is there to this day in Chengdu, in modern day Chengdu. But yes, it is hard to say what the legacy is, and I'm not sure to what extent that's just because of timing. He really comes in at a full, not just a full, but a static country without any kind of dynamism or energy, and then it falling not to another dynasty that would consider itself Chinese, but a foreign horse peoples, and that really sort of puts the puts the ice on any kind of development with regards to that. And then of course you get the fall of the Portuguese and Spanish Empire, and the Jesuit mission not getting much in the way of support that they could have had. and then the British come in the Victorian era and meet China at another trough. So yes, it's very hard to say. Within just a few generations of Ricci, there isn't much of a legacy apart from these. These would be Ricci's own words in one of his letters. He sees himself as not planting the seeds to sow, to reap, but only clearing the forest. And those are his own words. He sees himself as only in the very early stages of evangelizing in his lifetime. He describes that in a letter. He says, I believe we're not even at the stage of sowing or harvesting at all. We're just clearing the forest.
I think, again, we're talking about the fundamentals of Jesuit strategy, which is always appealing to the top rather than trying to incite a mass movement of peasant converts, effectively. You can say that again, why it's important, I think, to always have a comparative approach, so this will be Japan versus China, is that you have a relatively open-minded figure like Oda Nobunaga, who was prepared to allow Christian missionaries. My ultimate belief is that it was a cudgel he was using against his religious rivals in the Buddhist, and the Lotus sect, and also the Land sect, or the Pure Land form of Buddhism, and wanting to establish foreign arms deals and things like that, and keep the entrepots in Nagasaki and Sakai going. But following on from that, we have a consolidation of an explicitly anti-Christian identity, and such was a way of consolidating the regime of the Tokugawa shogunate under Iemitsu. So even with the opposite conditions in Japan, strong political centralization under a native dynasty, the Christian reception there was actually far more severe in terms of the repercussions than what we see in China. Again, despite your sort of admonitions of the Qing dynasty, again, Kangxi was responsible for his original sort of edict of toleration, and like we saw with the Mongols, the original sort of aspect of Mongolia, of the Mongolian Empire, had this aspect of Nestorianism in it. So I think looking at this as a sort of uniquely Chinese phenomenon of Christianity, and trying to apply this to the Qing, who were Manchus from the north, it should be referenced. And they established their dynasty from 1644, and during most of the reign of Kangxi began to consolidate that control throughout most of China. And during Qianlong, established most of China's modern boundaries, which were actually larger in Qianlong than they are today. But the inner empire is, again, owed to the legacy and part of Qianlong. So again, you can read a version of events where the Kangxi Emperor and Yongzheng and Qianlong didn't effectively repudiate Western learning and Western trade and a more sustainable interaction with the West, as opposed to the brutal onslaught of the West in the period of the unequal treaties that we see following the Opium Wars. That is possible throughout the 18th century, but that didn't happen. And that, of course, can correspond with the progressive sort of prohibitions that we see against Chinese Catholicism from the 1720s onwards. But within Catholicism itself, the legacy of Matteo Ricci is even more fraught, despite, again, whatever results he was able to yield within China, because 20 years after his death, the Dominican order is able to induce the Sacred Congregation of the Propagation of the Faith, which is essentially the main missionary unit post-Tridentine reform of the Catholic Church, to denounce the Jesuit order, denounce the missionary work there, and denounce the accommodating stance of Matteo Ricci. There is some pushback against this, but ultimately the Dominican denunciation is the one which you can almost say frames this whole idea of the Chinese rites controversy, this inter sort of feuding branches of Catholicism, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and the Jesuits. And this only gathers momentum. It doesn't recede back as Chinese Catholicism basically dissipates into nothingness as a result of the prohibitions placed on it by the Qing emperors. So, for example, in the year 1715, Pope Clement IX promulgates Ex Illa Di, which affirms that the Chinese can only use the word Deus in referring to God, because the associations with Tian, which of course means heaven, which is de-anthropomorphized, Shangti, as mentioned earlier, and Tianzhu, which effectively means like heavenly king. All of these titles were seen as anti-conducive towards a orthodox Christian understanding and catechesis and worship and moral formation, as was any idea of the titles being used on Christian icons or images or any form of syncretism in terms of the presentation of certain objects towards religious veneration and worship. It explicitly, again, forbade Catholics from worshipping within Confucian temples. And again, the explicit prohibition was towards ancestor worship, filial piety, which has been mentioned. So again, the idea from the Dominicans and the Catholic hierarchy, the papacy, was that all of these elements, which are, you can say, falsely to some extent attributed to Ricci's policy of accommodation, were nothing more than a vehicle for syncretism, i.e. the fusion of Confucianism into Catholicism. Then we talk about the papal bull of 1756, Ex Quo Singulare. It's interesting actually reading this papal bull in general, in that the Chinese rites controversy is actually very limited in its scope here. It's rather a prohibition labeled against deviations of the Greek rite Catholics, the Uniate Catholics, an all branch of so-called accommodation with what the church refers to as pagan beliefs. But I think again, the limited scope, or how peripheral it was within the concept of trying to bring all of these outer variants of Catholicism into cohesion with the Latin Rite Catholics. All of this, again, is to denote that the actual legacy of Matteo Ricci isn't as a proselytizer within China. You can say, again, ironically, from the points that we've been trying to make about his heroic efforts of trying to find a way of bringing around a Confucian literati to understanding Catholicism, is his real legacy in many ways, which is that of affecting the European Enlightenment. So we again have the article from Liu. After his death, Ricci's theistic appreciation of Confucianism and his attack on Neo-Confucianism were both well publicized in Europe. Going to China as a foot soldier of the Christian deity, he unwittingly came back in his writings as ammunition for those European philosophical thinkers, most bent on subverting the church-centered old establishment. If Confucianism was somehow theistic, as he claimed in effect, it would mean the non-uniqueness of Christianity. Like I said, that's the unfavorable reading. If the ethical teachings of Confucius's latter-day followers were atheistic or pantheistic, as he also intimated, it would imply the possibility of for some reason I can't say that word, dispensability, of the Christian faith in relation to mortality and civil government. Either way, Ricci's information on China played a well-recognized role in the European Enlightenment. Those European thinkers who made the most of his ideas were profoundly dissatisfied with their own European conceptual framework. The undeniable and unpleasant problem of evil in particular led them to question the old mechanistic worldview that they inherited from Jewish and Christian mainstreams and European humanism. In their search for a new way of thinking that would allow them to avoid being caught between the Scylla of theism and the Charybdis of atheism, they became attracted to the organic perspective of Asia that showed the possibility of a world that was free but not chaotic, and that was regular but not mechanical. Hence, I say, I begin with the Enlightenment and I end with the Enlightenment, because again, it seems that the attitude within the Catholic Church was actually partly affirmed by the legacy of Matteo Ricci, which seemed to actually impress itself more on the European situation in the 17th and 18th century, more so on the Chinese situation. So say, for example, if you're talking about the reign of the Qianlong Emperor, to say that Catholicism had any serious influence on the Qianlong Emperor is laughable. I mean, we have the example of Giuseppe Castiglione, the Jesuit painter, for his accounts of the reign of the Qianlong Emperor, but he wasn't even a priest. He was simply associated with the Jesuit order. And it's not really until you can say, actually, the reign of the papacy of Pius XII that we see a relaxing of the prohibitions against the quote-unquote Confucian rites that are associated with Matteo Ricci. So with the papacies budging on that issue in the 1940s, with the post-conciliar attitude of Vatican II and Nostra Aetate, and with the accommodation following on from Mao, it seems that these events are uniquely conducive towards a reassessment of Ricci's legacy. So even though we can point to the period between the opening up of Macau in China and for the point of view of the Chinese, the disastrous period of the century of humiliation, and say that the Catholic presence was ephemeral at best, that despite of all of that, he does have a very enduring, multifaceted intellectual legacy that is as relevant today in terms of the Catholics dealing with a non-Catholic authority, being the Communist Party, as it was with the Confucians in the 16th century. Now, thank you. And thank you, James, for being very patient with me there. Would you like to say anything in summary or conclusion, or any other thoughts regarding Matteo Ricci before we go on to the super chats?
No, well, it certainly seems very unfortunate that these Enlightenment thinkers took from him many of these things, but in a way took God out of it. That's a shame. And if that's part of his legacy, then that very much needs to put to right, I think, from my impression of reading his accounts and from my impression and my knowledge of the Ming Dynasty context at the time. I suppose I could leave it with his own words, if that's all right with you, AM.
Sounds good.
This is Matteo Ricci writing in his Historia of China, which, by the way, to anyone listening, even to nowadays, he's writing in the early 1600s. He puts many modern historians to shame with his knowledge of China and his frankness about it. So I'll leave this to him. This is from Matteo Ricci's Historia. It often happens that those who live at a later time are unable to grasp the point at which the great undertakings or actions of this world had their origin, and I constantly seeking the reason for this phenomenon, could find no other answer than this, namely that all things, including those that have at last come to triumph mightily, are at their beginnings so small and faint in outline that one cannot easily convince oneself that from them will grow the matters of great moment.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end the conversation. Again, thank you so much, James, for your contributions to the stream. We only have the one super chat, which is from Rong Tao Wu, for $5. Thank you very much. Glad to have you both gentlemen around today. I missed the whole thing due to circumstances. AM, your Discord is gone, by the way. Yes, I'm aware, Rong Tao Wu. I've been somewhat distracted in the chat and having to deal with that situation in addition to hosting a stream and retaining a certain academic sense of rigor. But unfortunately, as with everything, I'm not really surprised. But thank you for your super chat, Rong Tao Wu. All I can say is commiserations very much to, and thanks, inexhaustible thanks to AGSJ, who has been a remarkable and stalwart manager of that Discord server for the couple of years it's been running. So my commiserations to him, and I just want to celebrate and have it on the record that he deserves recognition for all the work regarding that Discord, and it's thoroughly distressing that it's come to an end. But thank you very much, AJSJ. Big Ben for $20. Thank you very much. Hey mate, nice to catch you live. Love this channel, man. Well, thank you very much, Big Ben. Wrong Tawu, I had an earlier chat, not sure if it's gone as well. I can't see any earlier chat, so can you post it? Can you post it in the chat and I can read it there? Wrong Tawu. Big Ben, the Discord server, which is associated with this channel, but it's run by AJSJ. And yes, Wrong Tawu again. Long live the Discord. All right, James, you introduced the work you do on your channel earlier on, but is there anything else you would like to say before we leave tonight?
No, yes, you can find me at James Eno, all signed on it on YouTube, and thank you for having me, AM. And I've enjoyed this very poignant conversation that's had me thinking and at my limit of knowledge up until this point, and at times beyond it. Thank you very much.
No, that's okay. That's hopefully what this channel is useful for. So thank you. EM, is there any chance this channel will lead to any deeper discussions on Chinese history? I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest. The area of Chinese history which I'm most interested in covering is actually much earlier than this. It's actually the Song dynasty, referring back to the arrival of Neo-Confucianism in the 12th century. So for some reason, I'm attracted to that period in particular, post-Tang, before the Yuan dynasty. But again, it's a matter of expertise. There are a lot of angles from which I can approach this particular subject, but regarding the Song, again, very limited exposure, and I would say expertise for me to tackle that subject. I would recommend, for more Chinese content in general, that you once again check out James Cino Lit's channel. So thank you everyone, and good night.